Hey there, I'm so pumped to tell you about an amazing new community I've launched called Grief to Growth Circle Community. It's a space for people who are grieving to come together to support each other, and for people who want to know who we are, why we're here, and where we're going to have those conversations, all the things we talk about on the podcast. So I invite you to join me at grieftogrowth.com/community to become part of this compassionate crew. The best part, it's 100% free. And you have access to me in addition to everybody else in the community. In fact, the podcast will be there so you can talk about the things we talk about in the podcast right there in the community. There's also some premium content if you want to go deeper in the work I'm doing, but mostly it's about building relationships and community and about sharing resources and supporting each other. So come on over and check it out. It's grieftogrowth.com/community. I'll see you inside. Close your eyes and imagine. What if the things in life that cause us the greatest pain, the things that bring us grief, are challenges? Challenges designed to help us grow, to ultimately become what we were always meant to be. We feel like we've been buried, but what if, like a seed, we've been planted? And having been planted, we grow to become a mighty tree. Now, open your eyes. Open your eyes to this way of viewing life. Come with me as we explore your true, infinite, eternal nature. This is Grief to Growth, and I am your host, Brian Smith. Hey, welcome back to Grief to Growth, where we explore life's deepest questions, who we are, why we're here, and how we can find meaning in the journey, and also where we're going. So whether you're tuning in for the first time or you've been with us for a while, I'm glad you're here. And today I'm honored to welcome David W. Berner. David is an acclaimed award-winning author whose work spans fiction, creative nonfiction, memoirs, short stories, and poetry. With a career decorated by prestigious awards like the Eric Hoffer Book Award and the New York City Big Book Award, David has made a significant impact on the literary world. And his latest book is Daylight Savings Time, Essays on Literature, Art, and the Power of Growing Older, and offers a contemplative and deeply personal exploration of the aging process. In this episode, we'll dive into why David felt compelled to write about growing older, a topic that's often approached with trepidation, but here is embraced as a source of power and wisdom. We'll discuss the role of art, literature, spirituality, and travel in aging, and why Daylight Savings Time speaks to readers of all ages, not just those in their later years. David's reflections are not just about the process of aging, but about finding joy, solace, and meaning in every stage of life. So join us as we explore these rich themes and more. And after the episode, I invite you to continue the conversation with me and other listeners in our community space at grieftogrowth.com/community, where you can engage further with the ideas shared today. And with that, I want to welcome David W. Berner.
Brian, thank you. Appreciate it. So nice to be here and nice to be on you sound like you've done radio before. Your voice is just, melodic.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I have to tell you, getting started, when your bio came across my email, I was like, I really am excited about having this guy on. We're all growing older, but I'm 63, in those years where I'm contemplating retirement and stuff. And I want to start by saying there's this almost shame about growing older. And it's funny because I will tell people sometimes I'm old. And people will say to me, "You're not old. You walk 6 miles a day." I'm like, both things can be true. Old people can do things. So have you found there's kind of a stigma about growing older?
Well, that's a really good way to put it, though, with, you can do both. There's certainly a stigma. Our culture is, we've all heard this a million times over, but it's a culture of youth. There's no question about that. I mean, we've seen that in the presidential campaign here in America. I mean, it's, very much about that. And our media, our culture, our society, our entertainment, there's so much that's geared that way. And, I don't have an answer for that. I'm not a sociologist. I don't know why that is so, because in other cultures, in many cultures around the world, elders are sort of revered.
Right.
And you wonder why in America that's a different thing. We kind of put our elders like, well, we're going to move them over here for a while because they're kind of messing with our vibe, and even if you do that sort of metaphorically, I think we are kind of doing that. So to answer your question, yeah, I do think there's a stigma. I mean, um, when I play golf, I walk, and I love the game because it's a very mental game, and I like that part of it. But I would say 90% of the time I'm walking, and 18 holes of golf is about 6 miles,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't think anything of it. I mean, I'm tired, but I'm not debilitated,
Right.
right? And when I tell other people who are roughly my age that I walk, some will say, "Yeah, me too," or some will say, "What are you out of your mind?" And I say, "Have you tried it?" Because I wonder if you've just sort of if your process is, "Oh, I'm old now, so I need to take a cart." And not just about golf, but about anything. "Oh, I'm old now, I need to do this," or "I shouldn't do that because I'm old now," right? Yeah, I shouldn't try to do 20 push-ups because, I'm 65.
Right.
So really, should I do that? And then you kind of just say, "Well, no, I can't do that because I'm 65." Well, the truth is you probably can, or at least you can get to it, right? If you work on it. So I think culturally we've been stigmatized, and I mean we as far as older people, whatever
Mm-hmm.
that means, because back in the turn of the century, the 1900 turn of the century, old was 45, and that is not the case now, so due to a lot of reasons and mostly medical, but we know things. We know that smoking will kill you, and we know that if you eat McDonald's all day long for the rest of your life, you're probably going to die young. Just because. Not to say that you can't have a cigarette or you can't have a cigar now and then, maybe, but if you're going to indulge, you're going to hurt yourself, and
Mm-hmm.
your lifetime is not going to go. It's not going to, your span is going to be cut. And we know that. So now we're older, and older Americans have a lot of power these days, politically, even culturally, but I don't know if we use it all that much as best we could. So yeah, there is a stigma. And I think it's a matter of sort of looking at it differently. Not that I do it right all the time, or not that, I have all the answers. My book, Daylight Saving Time, is not about, it's not a self-help book. It's sort of a, hey, this is what I'm thinking. Maybe you ought to think like this too a little bit, or maybe you can take something from this and
Mm-hmm.
apply it to your world. Um, and That's how I wanted to approach it. I am not an expert on aging. I am not an expert on, anti-aging.
Mm-hmm.
um, I'm just a person who is, moving through the process just like everybody else. And here's what I've seen, and here's what I've observed, and here's what I'm experiencing. And maybe it can help us think about it differently, and maybe, get out of that stigma a little bit.
Yeah, well, I agree with a lot of what you said. It's really interesting to me. Again, when we talk about being old, and old is a relative term. I will say to people sometimes, okay, well, people, generation ago, 2 generations ago, died at 45. We are
Yeah.
objectively, old compared to them. Now, people are also living longer. My parents are 88 and 86, and they're both still in relatively good health. But when I say that I'm old to people, it kind of freaks them out, And one of the reasons is they're around my age, and they don't want to admit that they're old. So if I say
Yeah.
I'm old, then they have to admit that they're old.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's true. And it is relative. I mean, I had a grandfather who lived to be 91. My in-laws are both still alive. 86 and 92, I think they are, somewhere in
Mm-hmm.
there. Um, they're not infirm. And they're not going to walk 6 miles on the golf course, but they are, they're pretty mobile.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and both of their minds are still pretty sharp. Some of that's genetic, some of that's lifestyle, some of that's, just pure determination.
Yeah.
Like I'm gonna do certain things to make that work. Like my father-in-law does puzzles all the time, and I
Mm.
think that's helped him stay sharp. You know,
Yeah.
uh, and I think that we have to look at even those little tiny things like that. But the idea is, it's not about just living older. It's about living older well.
Right.
It's about mentally and emotionally and physically and all that. And, there are hiccups along the way for all of us. We have arguments with people we love. We have falling outs with people we love. We lose a job, we gain a job. Things that we want to do don't transpire the way we want to. But it's going to sound terribly cliche, but that's part of the journey. I mean, that is. I mean, the ups and downs are part of the journey. The
Hmm.
heartaches are part of the journey. The wonderful moments are part of a journey. And there's no reason to think about that differently when you're older. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Circumstances might be different, but it's the same thing. And I really, through this book, through Daylight Saving Time, I really wanted to show that, we are all hoping for that extra hour, and that's kind of what I mean by Daylight Saving Time. We're hoping for that extra time, right? Um, but what are you going to do with it?
Right.
Are you just going to watch another Netflix series
Right.
or what are you going to do? Which is okay, but what are you going to do with that time that you have left? Well, how are you going to process it? And I believe that you have to take some risks. Um, and that's also part of the journey too. And those risks can be all kind of ways. But
Hmm.
I think you've got to do that. I just started after putting it off for a long time at the age of 67, I just started going to a trainer. And I've been putting it off for a long time. And she kicks my butt.
Hmm.
But I'm really happy that she's kicking my butt. It's not that I'm super out of shape. I actually am fairly, mobile and fairly agile for a 67-year-old. I wouldn't call myself an athlete, but I
Hmm.
think I get around better than a lot of other 67-year-olds,
Hmm.
but I still don't feel like I still feel like I could be better.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's my journey. That doesn't mean everybody has to go get a trainer. That's not what I'm saying.
Right.
But find that thing that gives you a little bit of a boost, that gives you a little bit of a moment of grace, something like that, um, that will kind of lift you over the stigma that you brought up before about, oh, well, I'm old now. Well, I guess I can't do that anymore.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hey there, I'm testing out a new feature. I'd love to get your feedback on it. It's called Fan Mail, and you can send me a message right from the show notes of the podcast. So look for the link that says send me a text. You can ask a question for a future podcast. You can suggest a guest or just give me any feedback you want. Just remember, it is one way. I can't text you back, and I will not have your name, your email address, or your phone number unless you include it in the message. Let me know what you think. Time for a real quick break. Make sure you like and subscribe. Liking the video will show it to more people on YouTube, and subscribing will make sure you get access to all my great content in the future. And now back to the video. Yeah, well, it's a really interesting point you bring up because I think as you mentioned, doing puzzles, for example. My father does puzzles. I think he still does every single day, and he used to get two newspapers when they still had them every day and do both of those puzzles. My mother is still extremely active, and and it's funny because everybody is trying to tell her to slow down. And I was talking to her a little while ago, and I said, I think this is what's keeping you young is the fact she still travels, she still does things that she probably shouldn't be doing, but I think it's better to do that to push yourself than to just sit in a chair and say, "Well, I'm 88 now. I can't do anything."
And I also think that people who are, whatever older is, don't realize the capacity they still have to do things.
Right.
They've been programmed to think that, oh, well, I'm not supposed to be doing that. Well, the reality is, I mean, you see these stories all the time. The 90-year-old who runs the marathon. Yeah, they're the outliers. I get that,
Hmm.
but that should tell you something, right? And y- I don't think you want to get into a boxing ring with a 25-year-old at 90. That's probably not a good plan. But shadow boxing at 90, sure. Maybe even, getting into a ring with the right kind of rules and regulations with another 90-year-old isn't a bad idea either. I mean, I don't, why not? I mean, I don't
Right.
understand why that is, or, that kind of thing. I don't know if that's the greatest analogy in the world, but I think that those kinds of things are still available to us if we wrap our arms around it and go, okay, what can I do with this? What can I do? I mean, I didn't start writing, seriously writing. I mean, I was always in journalism, but I never, it's funny. I didn't really think of that as like the writing, but I thought of writing was differently in my head. But
Hmm.
so in journalism, I was always kind of writing, but I didn't really think about writing seriously in books until I was in my 40s. And, eh, I, you know, for some people, that would have been like the time to start thinking about, you know, the second half of your life or even the second last third of your life. And I, started a whole different, you know, vocation at that time.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of people are still doing that. I'm not special with that. I think a lot of people are, reevaluating much more than they used to. The old days of being at the job for 50 years and getting the gold watch, those days are long gone.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and in a way, it's kind of good because you can get very, very set in your ways and set in your thoughts and set in your beliefs about yourself and your family and your life if you're stuck like that. And I think yeah, that's a good thing. It was nice to have pensions when there were pensions, those
Right.
kinds of things are probably not a bad thing to think about. But the reality is we set ourselves up to be sort of walking down the road with the guardrails on, just saying, well, this is what you do. I just keep doing this. I keep going to the mill and working every day because that's what you do,
Right.
right? I just want people to maybe just rethink that. That's all.
So, I know you've written about, speaking of writing, you've written about all different types of things, written fiction. What inspired you to write on the subject of growing older?
Well, it's probably a number of things, but the certainly the thing that kind of clicked it over was I had a mild heart attack in my 50s, that was exactly the same age as my dad's heart attack when he
Mm.
had it, which is kind of freaky. Um, and my dad survived and he lived a pretty decent life for a lot of years after that, and hopefully I'm doing the same thing. Um, but I have to say it didn't necessarily scare me. It just made me say, wow, yeah, I guess this is kind of like a finite thing, isn't it? I'm
Mm.
not going to be here forever for one reason or another. Funny, I had a conversation with my son last night too. He said he used to be a chef years ago, but that lifestyle is just too much when you got a daughter and kids, and it's just too hard. But
Hmm.
he still cooks and he still makes things. He was making 40 pounds of tomatoes to make all these different sauces, and his wife's Italian. So he wanted to make these sauces, and he goes, I want to make this my sauce. I want it to be the thing that my daughter grows up and goes, remember dad's sauce? Here's the recipe. I'm going to make that tonight. He says, I want that to be sort of like uh her remembering me, in
Mm.
a way. And I thought that was really an interesting thought. And I thought about the same thing when I had the heart attack. I started thinking about, well, what are they going to take with them of me? And not because I was egotistical about it, but they're going to take something because I was around in their life. Um, what is it? What's it going to be? And it made me start thinking about, okay, well, what are you going to do with the rest of that time with them, with you, with the people you love, with your things that make you happy, the things that challenge you. What are you going to do? So the heart attack was some of it. There's no question about that. And I even opened the book up with that story.
Hmm.
Um, Luckily it was mild. Luckily I had no damage. Luckily I came out of it pretty good. It was a few weeks afterward, and I went on a 12-mile bike ride after that, and my doctor was mad. He said, "Really?" And I'm like, "Well, I felt fine." He started laughing. He goes, "Well, you're lucky." He just thought that was pushing it a little too early. It probably was.
Mm.
Um, 12 miles was in my world of biking is kind of low. 20 miles is probably 25 is probably a good number for me these
Hmm.
days. But to do 12, a few weeks after the heart attack, he thought I was a little out of my mind. But I felt pretty, and I probably was, but I felt pretty good.
Hmm.
So I'm glad I didn't keel over. But
Right.
I was lucky enough to not have any damage. It was a mild one. I noticed that something was off. And, but to have it on the same year as my father, same age as he was when he had his was a little freaky. And I asked the doctor about that, and he said, genetics do play a huge part in this kind of thing. He
Mhm.
says, you probably have a better diet than your dad did. And I said, yeah, my dad would sit down and eat a bag of Oreos on a Saturday night sometimes. I don't do that. I said, but, I'm not perfect, but he says genetics are pretty strong. And he says that this is probably part of that. And so here I am. But that kind of kicked my thinking about, okay, what are you going to do? What are you going to do with that rest of that time? What's that mean? I didn't really start to write that or seriously think about writing something about it till years later.
Mm.
But that was the thing that sort of made me start to process the idea of aging and what that really means.
Right.
That would be the thing.
Right. So I know your personal stories and your emotions are deeply woven into the book. Why did you feel what prompted you to share those intimate parts of yourself?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Hi there. I'm really excited to tell you about my latest ebook. It's 4 lessons that you can learn from the near-death experience without going through all the trouble of dying to learn them. I've been studying NDEs for several years now. I am completely convinced that not only are they 100% real, but that there's some very universal wisdom that we can get from the near-death experience. And I've distilled that down in this book into 4 short lessons. And I've also given you all the reasons why I believe that NDEs are absolutely real. So go to www.grieftogrowth.com/NDE lessons to pick it up for free. www.growth.com/NDE lessons. I hope you enjoy it.
I teach personal storytelling and I teach memoir, and people
Hmm.
always ask me, how can you be so open? Um, I don't know how, it's just my nature, I guess. I don't know how to be any other way. I've never been a closed person. I don't want to say I'm the kind of guy who walks up to strangers and start telling them my story. I'm not that guy. But, we again, a terrible cliche, but it's true. We have so much more in common than we don't in the world between each other. And sometimes when you explain to people that this is what you're going through or what you're thinking or what you've dealt with, they'll go, "Oh yeah, me too. Let me tell you my story." And humans are storytellers. We've been doing this since caveman days, right? So that's that's what I learned to be. And why didn't we even learn it? I think it was innate for me. And I don't
Hmm.
know why that is. And my dad told great jokes. My dad was a great joke teller. So he was really good at it. Um, but, sort of the old school jokes, almost, minor dad jokes, if you want to call them that. But he
Right.
was good at it. He was really good at it. And my mother was a voracious reader. So I think maybe some of those things kind of came together in my
Hmm.
genetics. Um, I remember when I was a young man, 18, 19, I was in college, and all I wanted to do was be on the radio and play, Led Zeppelin all day long. I had hair at the time. I had long hair at the time. I was that guy, right? And
Right.
I really wanted to do, that's what I wanted to do with my life. No one else of my forebearers had been to college before. I had a
Hmm.
lot of people in my family that didn't even finish high school. So, I was the guy, I was the outlier. And that's what I wanted to do. I didn't know any better. I didn't know to be a lawyer or a doctor or any of that stuff. That wasn't in my world. I came from a working class family, which I've learned to embrace. And I write about that in the book too. Um, and I started thinking about how was I going to do that? And why do I want to do that? And the very first job I got in radio was at a country music station. At the time, country music was the urban cowboy days. It was like huge. Um, but it wasn't my thing. I learned to like some of it, and I've learned to like some of it now, even though the commercialized country I don't really like, but the sort of alternative country I do. But
Hmm.
I thought, okay, I'm going to be on the radio and I'm going to play music, and that's my thing. And I played music, and I was a guitarist and a piano player, and I wasn't great, but I was good enough to play in a band, in the summers at bars and stuff. So I had this thing about music, and the very first job I got out of college in radio was not music, it was news.
Mm,
And I learned through that process of those jobs that it really wasn't about the music. It was about the stories. I was a storyteller. The news, the stories in music, you know, the story, especially like, the stories that came out of people like Bob Dylan, who were basic storytellers. Those were magnificent to me. And I started to realize, well, that's what I am. And I became a reporter and I told stories. In fact, when I was a news director for a long time, I used to tell my reporters, a small group of guys and women, before we'd have our editorial meeting or after the editorial meeting, I would just say, go tell me good stories. Just
yeah.
because I thought that was the essence of it anyway. Just tell me a good story. And I learned in time that that's what I was.
Mhm.
And but it took me to my 40s to really say, oh, well, maybe I should focus on some books. Maybe I got something there that I could do.
Mhm.
So to answer your question, I think I always was a sort of closeted storyteller that wanted to tell stories, and it was easy to tell stories about yourself because you already have that information, right? You don't
Right.
have to go research it; you already got it, right? So I started to do that. My very first book was a memoir. It was about the time that I spent teaching in a underprivileged school, and it was the book was called Accidental Lessons, is called Accidental Lessons. And the reason it's called that is because the kids stopped me. I mean, they really did. I walked out of there going, holy Moses. As troubled as some of these kids are and as difficult as some of their lives are, they're teaching me.
Mhm.
And that year was an awakening for me. Um, and I started to realize too that if I tell that story, maybe other people will open up to the possibilities of listening to others about where they fit into their world and how they fit into the world like you do, and it may be different than yours, but we do share a lot.
Mhm.
Um, so, to answer your question, I think it came innately, but it didn't crystallize to me like, oh, that's it until time passed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, since the book's come out, have you gotten a lot of, or have you gotten people going, well, me too, because,
Yeah, I have. I mean, I've noticed that in some reader reviews, and I've noticed that with a couple of emails that relate to that. Um, yeah, I think it is a me too. And that's was my goal. I didn't want it to be as they say in my world, a navel gazer. I didn't want it to be like, oh, look at me over here. I'm looking at myself, and it's so cool, and I'm so cool. That I didn't want it to be that. And in fact, good memoir shouldn't be that. It should be about the human condition, the shared human condition.
Mhm.
And I always teach my classes I'll say, when I say the word mother, all of you have some visceral reaction. Good, bad, ugly, funny, humorous, sad, whatever it is, you have some visceral reaction. The reason is because we all share it somehow. Even if we didn't even know our mother, our biological mother, we have some visceral reaction to that word. That's the shared human condition. So when I write about personal stories, my own, I try to be sure that I'm not uh, turning it into, holding the mirror up to myself.
Mhm.
Um, Sometimes that's a tricky job. I'll have to be honest, but I do think that that's important
Yeah.
to do that because that's the way you connect with readers. That's the way you connect. I mean, that's why memoir works is if you find that ground in your stories that is similar, that is alike, that you share.
Yeah, I completely agree. I found that when I read a memoir or people read memoirs, we're not reading just about the person's experience that they had, but it's like how does it relate to something that I've had, even though they're not exactly the same circumstance. We're
Right.
looking for ourselves in that other person.
Yeah, I think when memoir is done well, it casts a shadow, and that shadow kind of comes over the reader.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's where the connection is made. That's when, if someone reads a memoir and doesn't know why doesn't, clearly know in their heads why it's making a visceral reaction for them. Well, the likelihood is that you're sharing some human condition experience.
Right.
You don't even realize sometimes that, like, why did my heart flutter when he told me that story? Or, well, that's because I had this happen and it's kind of similar, or it's, you know, it has the same sort of, DNA in it somehow,
Right.
you know? Yeah.
So we've already touched on daylight saving time is not it's not a guide to aging. It's not a it's not a how-to book. It's really more, I guess, reflections. So what did you discover about joy, solace, and finding meaning in later years of life?
Well, that's a really good question. Um, well, joy is, it's kind of the kind of thing that can't be defined because it's different for everybody else. Um, but I get joy out of just looking at my granddaughter, or I get joy out of taking a walk in the woods, or I get joy watching a good football game. I mean, there's all kind of ways to get joy, and that's maybe a little different, but somewhat overlapping to some of us. Or certain things that are all of us enjoy. So the joy part, I think, is what I learned from that is that it's out there every day.
Hmm.
It's there every day. We just have to be cognizant of it. Sort of, I don't want to say looking for it necessarily, because I think that could be a problem, but be aware that it's there, and you just have to sort of embrace it. Solace is another thing for me. There's a difference between being alone and being lonely, and lonely is a lack of connection, a lack of meaning, and being alone can be a great thing. It can, if you learn how to be alone well, you're probably got a pretty healthy mind. Um, and for me, solace is a wonderful thing. There are times I really like to be alone. And it's not about being lonely. It's not about being a recluse. It's sort of about just taking stock of my own stuff. Um, and I love that part of it. And I do talk about that a lot in the book. I talk about how that is an important thing. But it's
Hmm.
also, of those things you talked about, there's also another thing that is sort of like that, and there are sort of threads of this in the book, is that understanding where we come from, either, family, or, the places where we grew up, or we, came of age, those spaces and time all inform us, and they all shape us. We can't help it. Um, some of us kind of reject it, like, oh, I was born here and I hate that town now and I don't want to have anything to do with it. Well, it's okay. I guess you can have that feeling. But somewhere along the line, that town or that thing or that neighborhood shaped you. And it shaped you, good, bad, or ugly, but it
Hmm.
shaped you. And finding how that fits into who you are, I think, is really, really interesting. It took me a long time. I grew up in Pittsburgh. I think I mentioned that.
Hmm.
And when I was there in my 60s and early 70s into the mid 80s, it was a transforming town. It was, a steelworkers, working class guy with a lunch bucket going to work. In the 60s, 70s, the steel mills started to close. It became a completely different town. We had 20% unemployment. It was bad. And then in the 80s, it started to transform itself. It became a medical hub. It became later on, it became a technical hub.
Hmm.
Google tested its first, autonomous car um, in Pittsburgh. So it became something different. It still hangs on to that legacy. But what Pittsburgh has done really well, the legacy of the steel mills, is that it's embraced the legacy. It's what we were back in the day that made us who we are today. And I think that's true for all of us.
Hmm.
It's,
Yeah.
everywhere we've been, everything we've experienced, every town we've lived in, every apartment we rented, somehow that's informed us. And you may not have liked it all, but to understand that that is part of you and to see how it fits into what you are, I think helps inform how you move forward.
Right.
And I think that, I talk a lot about that in the book, about family history and where my, family came from, and where how I started to realize that that was a good thing to be. There was a time when I was shunning the working class world. No, I want to be, can't, I'm no. But I look back and now I'm like, man, that was pretty damn cool.
Yeah.
I'm glad I had that experience.
Yeah.
I feel very, very, very happy about that. I embrace that now. I love it. So maybe with that age too comes a little wisdom, so which
Right.
is a good thing. Yeah.
So speaking of that, so have you found it easier to find joy and solace and meaning and all those things as you get older?
Easier is a good word, a good, interesting word, because I don't know if it's necessarily easier, but I think I'm quicker to recognize it.
Mm, okay.
I'm quicker to embrace it. I'm quicker to say, "Oh man, take this moment and take this in." I'm quicker to do that than I used to be. Um, when you're young, you always want to, okay, what's the next thing? What's the next exciting thing? What's the next experience I want to have? What's the next thing? Um, I think when you start to get older, you start to say, you know what? Let's take this in a minute. Let's, in a way, physically slow down, but also sort of mentally slow down a little bit and let it seep in.
Hmm.
I can make the connection to my son's sauce. The sauce is going to be good because it sat on the stove for a day and a half, in a slow burn, right? I think that's okay for us too. As we
Hmm.
get older, we start to slow down and you're like, you know what, this is going to be better if I just take my time here and take it in and accept it and realize it. And I think we also understand ourselves better when we do that. Even if we mess up, and we do something wrong or do something we didn't like or handled a particular moment not very well, if you step back, really feel what that felt like for whatever you did, really, I mean, really let it feel. Don't fight it. Um, Sometimes that's really painful, but if you do that, I think you can be better the next time.
Hmm.
But if you brush it off and move on and say, well, that was just a thing, I didn't really mean that, I'm moving on. I don't think you allow the time to understand it. Um, Sometimes that's really hard, but I think that that's an important process in aging, and I think it kind of comes naturally to all of us. I think if you asked anybody who's your age or my age, that they would say, "Yeah, I slow down and take it in a little more." I
I think
think
it.
I think I
I,
do.
I think it can. Well, for me, I would say, yeah, I do find it easier to find all those things we talked about, joy and peace and meaning, the older I get, because of the wisdom, as you mentioned, and the perspective that we get with age. When I was young and something happened that set me back, I thought it was the end of the world. It's
Yeah,
like, and you don't get to see the long arc. You don't get to see how things play out. And once you've seen several things play out that you thought were terrible, and you realize they turned out okay, or not only that, they were actually beneficial. Just for myself, I find that that's a perspective that I really enjoy about being older.
yeah, that's a really good point. I do think you don't see the long arc, and also when you're younger, whatever that means, whatever age that means, we all think we're immortal too. We all think,
Yes.
oh well, I didn't get it right this time. I'll get it right tomorrow. But when you start to get older, you're like, well, I may not have tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that in a sort of dark way. It's just reality.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
I may not have tomorrow to fix this or to make this right or to do it better. So I'm going to take it in. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to accept how I feel, and I'm going to go to the next thing.
Yeah. Well, I know I love the Olympics. I mean, and I've been watching the Olympics since I remember the first one I remember was in 1972. So over 50 years at this point. But when the Olympics were over this summer, I'm like, wow, the next one, if I'm here, I'll be 67. I don't have an infinite number of those in front of me anymore.
Mhm.
So I'm looking at it now like, enjoy it. Enjoy this one because I don't take for granted that, 4 years or 8 years are going to be around for the next ones.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I took a trip to Ireland and England and Wales with my wife, and kind of, I don't want to say talked her into it, but it definitely was my sort of like thing.
Mm-hmm.
She's a lot less interested in sort of lineage than I am.
Mm-hmm.
I became more interested when I got older, but I was always, I remember being in my 30s and my mother talking about certain things in it. I had an interest, I just didn't delve into it. So we took that trip, and it was like you say, it was the thing. Well, if I'm going to do this, let's go do it now,
Right.
because I don't know if I'm going to be around, or I'm going to be, physically or mentally well enough
Right.
10 years from now to take on this journey. So I'm really glad I did it. Yeah.
Yeah. Now I know you say the book is not just for people that are going through the aging process. So what can people who are not going through the aging process, why would they want to read it?
Well, first of all, I think everybody's going through the aging
Well,
process. When
that's
you're
absolutely
12,
true.
you're going to be 15 someday, right?
It's
So,
absolutely true.
yeah. So not that to say that this book is for 12-year-olds. I don't know if it would be an interesting enough read for a 12 or 15-year-old. But I think if you're 25, I don't see anything there that it doesn't say something about, moving through your 20s and going into your 30s. Yeah, I talk about different things and different eras, but I think those, don't think it's necessarily a lesson, but I think those observations are true for anybody,
Mm-hmm.
about moving through the process. Um, yeah, I think it rings truer for people who are 50 and older, because, you know, you're it's almost like, when you and I of our age mention a television show, we all connected that television show that was back in the 70s. And somebody who's 35 goes, I don't even know what the 70s are. Um, you know, uh, there's a there's this connection that we all have, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that somebody, who there might be some things in the book that someone might go, well, what's he talking about? There might be a few things in there, but I do still think they can see the process, and maybe in a weird sort of way, the book uh, opens the mind up a little bit for that 30-year-old to go, oh, geez, well, I'm 50. Maybe I had to think about this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, so I think there's some, I'm not trying to give them a great marketing plan here. The book's for everybody. That's not necessarily what I'm saying. But because some people may not be interested, but I do think that there's there are threads in there that no
Mm-hmm.
matter your age, I think you can get something from it, and you
Yeah.
can see your life in it. I think so.
Well, it's funny. Let's talk about the aging process. I have a daughter who's 27. She'll be 28, very soon. And when she was younger, she would talk about old people this, old people that. She didn't like being around old. And I said, you're going to be there one day too. And when she was, a teenager, 12, 13, 14, she just couldn't even see it. But now that she's 27, I hear her saying things like, oh, yeah, we went to the bar and there were so many kids there. They all look so young. And, she's very, very thin. And she's like, I'm concerned about putting on weight. And I just sit back and grin, because again, she's going through that aging process in her little mini way, right? She's 28,
Yeah,
but
that's
but she's starting to
absolutely true.
understand that I'm not always going to be the age I am now.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think that's really cool, and she's very mature, and she's maturing very quickly. But as you were talking about that, and we talked earlier about the wisdom of people who are older, my grandmother lived with us for about 13 years, from the time I was 8 until she passed, and I was in my early 20s. And I remember, even to this day, even though this was over 50 years ago, sitting at the kitchen table with her, and some of the wisdom that she gave me, which I didn't appreciate it at the time, but I still quote her today because it was brilliant. So
Yeah.
I think a
Yeah.
book like this for people that can grasp it at their early age can give them a big leg up.
Yeah, and I think you have to be willing to grasp it too. I have two sons. My younger son is the one who lives in the area,
Mm-hmm.
and he's 31, and he'll say things every once in a while like, "Well, that's what you said. You said that." And I'm like, "I did?" Like, yeah. So it's amazing how much impression you've placed on people. You're the people that you've been around with a long time.
Sure.
You don't realize that. You don't, you think you are, you hope you are maybe. And all the good things, not the bad things, right? But but he'll even say things like, "You know why I like Creedence Clearwater Revival, don't you? Because of
Yeah.
you."
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like, because you would have never known anything about that band if it wasn't for me, right? So and so he said that's made an influence on me about what I like, what kind of music I process. Um, and that's a, kind of an odd way to connect with that, but I think that's true. That but people don't begin to see that until they start to get older,
Mm-hmm.
and something comes back to them that they experienced from some elder somewhere, and they're
Right.
like, wow, wait a minute. Didn't grandpa do that? Or whatever. But you don't think about that when you're 20. I just, you're so self-involved when you're 20. There's no way you're thinking about that. Only the very, very aware person is going to pick up on stuff like that when they're 20.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, again, I think the book is for those people that, and it depends on what age you get it. I think that's what it kind of comes down to, right? It could come earlier, or for some people, it doesn't come till they're later, and some people it never comes at all.
Yeah.
So we're all different in terms of our awareness. I want to ask you about the subtitle of your book, which I think is really interesting: Essays on Literature, Art, and the Power of Growing Older. So, how did you choose a subtitle, and how does that reflected in the book?
Yeah, well, I wrestled with the word power a lot
Hmm.
because, and I'll tell you why, because it started to feel like, okay, that could be very self-helpy. And, um, and I played around with some other words, but I think what it came down to for me, the power of growing older, is that there is power in growing older if you accept it as power. If you say, I can use this. This is fuel, right? Um, I'm more wise. I'm more worldly. I'm more aware. I've had the ups and downs. I've had the things that I've screwed up and the things that I've done well. I got some toolboxes here now. Um, and that's power. So, my publisher even said, no, they have no problem. We're going to use that. I don't want you to change it. So yeah, there's a lot in the book about that toolbox.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot in that book about how music and art and literature shape us, even if it's subtle.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for me, it was more the subtle. But we have the human condition allows us to enjoy art and process art, in whatever form it might be. Um, and that is uniquely human, right? I mean, dogs aren't going around looking at Picasso's, not the same way we are.
Right. Right.
Um, so funny though, dogs do react to music. So it's interesting, but that's where the title came from. That's why the power of growing old was the thing that I wrestled with. But I do think that makes a lot more sense now to me.
Mm-hmm.
I really wasn't sure about it at the beginning. You know, um, I just didn't want it to sound like a self-help book because I
Mm-hmm.
didn't want to imply that it was, and have people read it and go, "Oh, well, this isn't what I thought it was." Actually, I
Right.
did have one reader review somewhere on the online, platforms. Someone said, "Well, this book is not what I thought it was going to be," but it was. I still liked it.
Okay.
I thought to myself, "Well, that's probably what she thought. She probably thought this was going to be the step-by-step process of how you make aging a better experience.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I'm sure there's some things in there you can use, but that's not what it was meant to be.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting as you talked about the word power. I thought, okay, well, there's advantages and disadvantages to every phase of life.
Yeah.
When you're younger, we talked about this. Physically, we can do things that we can't do anymore. I never liked running anyway, but now I can't run. So, it's not something I can do anymore. I used to love to play volleyball. I don't play volleyball anymore, but I'm a pretty good pickleball player.
Mhm.
So there, and again, I have this perspective on life, and I watch younger people going through things, and I sit back and I kind of smile because I know the thing that's like a really really big deal for them right now. I didn't get this promotion, or it's going to be delayed now for like a whole month. It's like my boss screwed this up, and it's going to
A
be a
whole
month.
month.
It's going to be a month before I get my promotion, and I'm like, okay. Okay, that perception of a month changes when you're 63 as opposed to when you're 30.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Yeah.
So there is power in it. I know I wouldn't shy away from saying that. It doesn't mean it's better or it's worse. But the one thing that's better is I think we have that perspective to choose. Like, okay, I understand that I do have an advantage here with that. I wouldn't have understood when I was younger.
Right. Right.
So we talked about
And
art. Oh, go ahead.
no, I was going to say that only comes with aging. I know it sounds like a cliche, but you only get that when you start to get older. I mean, I just don't. There are very few people who are younger who are that wise about that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, I know for me, it definitely came with age. And I'm still learning and learning how to be gratitude. Gratitude is something when I
Sure.
was in my 20s and 30s. Yeah, don't even talk to
Yeah.
me about that.
No,
Um,
exactly.
but now it's like, oh, okay, I can get out of bed, right? My knees are okay. I can still walk 6 miles a day. I'm grateful for that. Whereas I
Yeah.
would have taken that for granted when I was in my 20s.
Right. Yep. Yeah. So
So we,
true.
we talked about art and literature and stuff. How does spirituality play into this, if at all?
It does. There's a thread of spirituality through the book, and you know, that some people may go, "Oh, really? Spirituality again? Great." And other people may embrace it. But the way I approach it is that I have always been a searcher. That's why I like to describe myself. I don't know what's out there. I just know that there's something. I don't know what that is. I just know that there's something bigger than me. I don't know what that means. I don't claim to know what it means.
Hmm.
I grew up a Catholic, did the whole, you know, uh, catechism classes, all the good stuff that you do. Um, but I rejected it when I got into college. It was the early 70s, and if you were 18, you were rejecting a lot. It didn't fit well into my world, and it still didn't. I tried to go back to more organized religion later in my life. Sometimes it felt right, sometimes it didn't. Then I started to think about, you know, um, Buddhist philosophies. I started thinking about, Native American philosophy, and all of that informs me somehow. But I have determined that at this point, I am nothing more than a searcher. That's all I do. I don't have an answer. I don't have an idea. I don't have a dogma. I don't have a core belief that guides me. But I do think that there are pieces of things out there. Um, and it's funny though, many of the spiritual beliefs and religious beliefs have a lot of overlap that we tend to forget. We tend to think of them as being siloed, and they're really not. There's a lot of this. And if we can find that little bit of overlap and go, oh, okay, that everybody thinks that, like, do unto others as you would, have them do unto you. I mean, that's true in every religion out there
Right.
in some phase, right? So, I think that there's a thread that I sort of ride, but in the book, I kind of, delve into that a little bit about what that means and what it means to just believe in something bigger than you. Um, you know, it's hard not to think, especially when you're younger, it's hard not to think of yourself as the center of the universe, you know? And the reality is you are far from that. It doesn't mean your life doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that your life can't influence or make good or whatever, but you are not the center of the universe. Um, and I think when you start to know that and realize that, the the spiritual part of your life becomes a little more easy to understand. Um, and if you're not so hardwired or in the cement about a particular dogma, I think you also can be more accepting to other people's beliefs.
Mhm.
You know, if you're hardwired and your feet are in the cement on something, and we see this, right? Then, I mean, that's what wars are about for most part.
Right.
Um, that if you can stop doing that and believe that everybody is on their own journey and that everybody is in some aspect a seeker and a searcher, um, I think we'd all be better off. Um, Not easy to do,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
not easy to do.
Well, it's interesting because, and I know the book is not prescriptive. We're not telling people how to do things. So I
Right.
know you're very, very clear about that. But I was curious about your own experience. With my experience, I deal a lot with death. I deal with people who have, I work with people who have lost people. I'm very much into spirituality, afterlife, and all that stuff. That is one of the things that brings me the greatest peace as we age. And this is, I think, one of the reasons why we don't revere aging in our society is because we're scared that we're going to die. And the older that we get, the more likely that is to happen. So
Hmm.
I think it's one of the reasons why we have all the issues we have with aging, why we want to hide old people away and not look at them, because it's like, you're headed to where I don't want to go.
It's a reminder, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, and if you do believe in something after life, and a lot of people don't even think of it as something after life, they just think it's a continuum somehow, right? It's a continuum.
Hmm.
It's just in a different form, and that might be true. But there's also a part of me that's like, nah. When we die, we're dust. We go to the earth. That's it. It's over. Done. There's a part of me that believes that too.
Hmm.
Um, I waver.
Hmm.
I waver all the time. Um, I don't think that makes me any better or different or worse or anything else than anybody else.
Hmm.
I just tend to think that I guess my core belief is we don't really know. We don't have a clue.
Hmm.
You know, I remember my mother saying to my grandmother, like your life, my grandmother lived with us for a while when I was younger.
Hmm.
Uh, and I remember my mother saying and that doesn't happen much anymore, by the way. And I think that's also an interesting thing about aging. Back in the 40s and 50s, that was a normal thing.
Right.
That
Right.
your grandparents lived with you for a while. But I remember my grandmother saying to my mother, "If there is an afterlife, I'll let you know." Okay. Um, and the interesting part of that is, and I don't remember if I wrote this in Daylight Saving Time or another book, frankly, but there was a very strange incident that happened. When my grandmother died, she died upstairs in the bedroom, and my mother didn't know she had passed. She passed during the night.
Mm.
And a couple of days after the funeral, the neighbor next door, now this is someone who's not even connected to our family, and it was kind of a neighbor that, you'd say hi to, but you weren't really friendly with. The neighbor said, "Hey, I'm sorry about your mother. And, I waited a while, but I wanted to tell you something." She said, "Yeah, sure." She said, "I was at my kitchen sink on Sunday morning early and I was doing dishes. And from my kitchen sink, I could see out the back window. And she said, I saw your mother walking through the backyards."
Mm.
And I said, "She hasn't been well and she's old. What is she doing back there?" And she watched her and then she kind of like disappeared into the kind of a wooded area that we lived in. And she didn't think anything of it. An hour later, the ambulance shows up at the house.
Wow.
Coroner's office showed up at the house. And she said, "I didn't want to tell you until some time had passed, but," she said, "I just thought that was really odd." And did your mother take a walk that morning? And my mother said, my mother was never out of bed.
Right.
And she said, are you sure you thought that was my mother? I said, I know what your mother looks like. That was her.
Right.
So my mother started thinking, well, that was the sign then, right?
Yeah, that
That
was the
was the
sign.
sign. Thumbs up. Maybe it's true.
Well, I
Certainly a
gotta
great story.
I gotta tell you, I got goosebumps as you were saying that. Um, and it's really interesting because in the world I live in, I wouldn't even question that. And I think it's really interesting how it goes back to our like giving people permission to tell stories. Because why did she hold that back from your mother even for the while that she did? Well, because I don't want to be seen as weird, or I don't want to be seen as
Right.
woo woo,
Right.
as we call it in the world that I'm in. Um, that's those things. They definitely happen. I totally believe what she said, and that's not. I'm not going to say it's not a rare occurrence. It's rare, but it's definitely not unheard of.
Mhm.
And so that's. I'm glad you told me that. It was a really interesting thing.
Yeah, it really, you know, whether she was really saw that or just delusional or was thinking about it, or maybe it was somebody else and she thought it was my grandmother. There's all kind of ways that you can rationalize it, right?
Sure, you can.
But she was pretty hardcore about, no, that was your mom.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was wild.
It is. I'm glad you shared that with me. So, now that you've written the book and you are where you are now, if you could go back and talk to your younger self, what would you say to younger David?
Don't worry so much. That'd be the very first thing I would say. It's gonna be fine.
Yeah.
It's gonna be ups and downs, gonna get ugly, accept the things that you don't do well, accept the things you screw up, the mistakes you made. It's gonna be okay. Accept them, move on. Um, yeah, I think I was like a lot of young people, pretty self-conscious,
Mm,
and maybe at times to a fault, you know. But I don't think that's unusual for a lot of people, young people. Um, so especially, those high school years, my God, and I think about high school. High school was awful. I mean,
yes.
I had a good high school. I mean, I had good friends, and I think I had a good experience. But you look back at it, it's like that is just a mixture of hell.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
not, it's not a good experience for a lot of people. Um, so yeah, I would say don't worry so much. Don't worry so much. Don't uh, don't anticipate that one thing that goes off the rails that it means it's always going to be off the rails. You know, and
Yeah.
I would even say that now to older people because it the bad things don't last and the good things don't last. You
Yeah.
know, yeah,
Yeah. Really important lesson. I think that I look at the suicide rate among young people now, and anxiety and depression, and I understand it. I get it because it's because of that all or nothing mentality. Because if things are bad, things are always going to be bad. You make a mistake, and I know people who have had a fight with their girlfriends, in their 20s and taken their lives,
yeah,
because it's like, oh, this is the end. And I remember breaking up with the girlfriend when I was in that age, or getting divorced at that age. And I remember, thinking, this is it. I'm never going to find anybody again. I was 25 years old,
right. Right.
So yeah, I think that's a great lesson for us to share with our younger selves, and to pass along to our children now, to give them that perspective as much as we can. We can't let them, they can't live in our shoes, right? But we can say, hey, I felt the same way when I was your age, and it worked out okay.
Yeah, right, right. And I guess the only problem with that is when you're young, you're like, yeah, whatever, Dad.
Yeah,
You're not
exactly.
you're not really accepting what you're hearing. You're like, yeah, that's not true because I know everything right now because I'm
Right.
20.
Right.
But I do think in time they start to. Hopefully, they do. You
Yeah. Well, as we talked about, me, I remember again sitting at the table with my grandmother when I was 16, and her saying these things to me, and I'm like, yeah, okay, but you're old. You've always been old. I thought she was born old, right? She's
Right.
she's
Yeah.
always been
Right.
this age. It took a while. It took probably 20 years before I started really appreciating it.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. I think my sons are are starting to get that now.
Yeah.
30, 32, 31, and 33, soon to be 33. Yeah.
Yeah, that's around the age when your parents start to say, "Oh, they do know something," right? And I
Right.
have to remind parents of that too, because I work with parents and they're like, "My kid's 15 or 16, they don't listen to me." I'm like, "That's what happens." I said, especially boys, because boys are brain damaged, so they're brain damaged until they're at least 25. So you have to expect that's the way they're going to act.
Yeah, I've said to when my granddaughter, who's only 3, but when she'll act up or be rebellious or try to manipulate, and I'm like, that's what they do.
Yeah,
That's finding themselves.
right, right.
They're pushing the envelope to figure out who I am. I said, it's just the deal. It's just the
Yeah,
process.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, again, all those phases that we go through, and like you and I can look at it and go, yeah, I remember being in my 20s, and I remember being in my 30s, and we can hopefully, maybe one day people in America will get back to the point where we respect and the elderly, the ancient
Yeah.
ones.
I think that might happen sooner than we think because we are getting older as a society by the day.
Yeah, that's true.
Where there are a lot more older, what you call older people with quotes around it,
Hmm.
now than there were many years ago. And yeah, we're still a youth-driven culture, but the older generation does have a lot of power, and we're gaining in numbers by the day. So sooner or later, maybe we'll get it.
Well, it's really interesting, not to get into politics too much, but we're looking at a guy over 80 and a guy pushing 80 as our presidential candidates, and now we have a 60-year-old in the race, and people are like, "Oh, she's young."
Yeah,
When's the last time we heard a 60-year-old called young?
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. That is very true. I hadn't thought about it in that way, but that's true. She's like the young gun now, right?
Right.
She's 60. Yeah. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting.
Well,
Wow.
David, it's been great getting to know you. Let people know, remind people about the name of the book, where they
Sure.
can find out more about you, and where they can get the book.
Well, I appreciate that. The book is Daylight Saving Time: The Power of Growing Older. It's from Collective Ink Books in the UK. It is available anywhere you buy online books. You can, if you're a big bookstore person and if they don't have it on their shelf, they can order it for you. That's great. I love
Mhm.
bookstores, but I understand the world is different today. So, however you do that, you can find it. As far as I'm concerned, me personally, you can find a lot about me at davidwberner.com. It's Berner. I do a Substack. If you're familiar with Substack, I do a Substack regular, call it regular essay on all kinds of things. And you can find that through my website or just Google it. I mean, Googling me you'll find me.
Yeah,
Yeah,
awesome.
it's pretty easy. Yeah,
Well, thanks for being here this afternoon. I know you're on your way to see your son. I appreciate you taking the stop to do this, and
absolutely.
enjoy the time with him and your granddaughter.
I really enjoyed this conversation. You have a great way of leading us through a lot of different subjects, and I appreciate it, Brian. It's been a great day.
Great
Thanks.
to see you. Have a great afternoon.
You too.
Hey there, if you like this episode, come on over and talk about it. Let me know what you liked. If you didn't like this episode, come on over and talk about it. Let me know what you didn't like. Go to grieftogrowth.com/community and look for Talk About the Podcast. I'll see you there.